Okay.
Okay, everybody. Hello. My name is Rick Sherman, Oregon Department of Education, Farm to School and School Garden Coordinator. Thank you for joining us. I'll explain about this meeting. It's a little bit different kind of webinar meeting. I am joined here with Amy Gilroy with Oregon Department of Agriculture, my counterpart, Farm to School Coordinator, and Matthew Barber, who is our person that does all of our writing for Oregon Education Child Nutrition Programs. So he'll be taking notes. And so just kind of going to go over the ground. Thank you. Exactly. Could you please mute your lines? That was a really good segue into that for somebody demonstrating what not to do on a phone call. So yes, I don't know if that was a cow or whatever, but yeah, thank you. Please mute your lines. Or we can mute everybody from here, I guess. But yeah, so there's that. And then we want a recording of this. I know some of you people we figure might be on the phone and might have to ask a question at the appropriate time. Let's wait, hold your questions for when we ask for them if we're going to verbalize them. But you can always put something in the chat box because we'll have a written record of that. And also, you can send me an email if you feel like, if you're driving and you get to where you need to go. You can find my email on the introductory notice to this, or if most of you know my email anyway, but it's rick.sherman@state.or.us. And we can put that in the chat box too for you. But anyway, so how this meeting is going to go, this isn't a typical kind of webinar with a lot of fancy slides. The only slide you're going to see is going to be our agenda, and we'll scroll through that. And basically, this is a stakeholder meeting for rule writing. So every time we have a bill, and this is for the Oregon Farm to School bill, we have to define things in rule that most of the things that we're talking about today, we've already covered in previous years. So there's just a few new things we have to tweak. Also, we have this meeting going on for 3 hours, but we don't anticipate it'll be that long, but we have the whole time blocked off. Just wanted to say that too. But anyway, so stakeholders, then your role is to just provide input, and no decisions are going to be made today, but we take everything into consideration. But basically, like there's new things like we're bringing in this child and adult food, CACFP, child and adult food care program into this mix. And so we have to like define some terms for that, for instance. And then there's this process of rule writing, which Matt is our expert in, and he gave a little bit in our overview. But basically, it takes about 45 days to get that out. And there's a long process. We have to introduce the rule at a state board of education meeting. And it's just like a school board meeting. Like they put things in, they ask questions, and then it goes back for consent agenda. And so it takes a number of months to do that. So we can go on our way in and operate the program for the procurement grant and the education grant because we've already been through that rulemaking process. So that brings me to my next point. This meeting today is just about those two portions. It's going to be about the Oregon Department of Education procurement grant. So that's the grant for reimbursement of Oregon grown and processed food, and the Oregon Department of Education education grant for ag-based, food-based, and art-based educational activities. So the other parts of the grant, which newly operated one, technical assistance, the evaluation, and the ODA infrastructure grant, we'll be having another stakeholder input call about that in the future. As we haven't introduced those yet, we have to go through a process. And so that'll be at a later date. But right now, this is a lot easier to ones because we've operated this grant for 8 years now. There's just some new players in here. So So what is not going to happen today, we're not going to go through nuts and bolts of how the operation, how the grants run, when the RFA will be issued for the education grant, although that's going to happen very soon. Things like that. We're just going to have to talk about terms of the that we need to define. Okay, so there is.
Can I add a few points of
please do.
Hi, everybody. This is Amy Miller at the Oregon Department of Agriculture. I just wanted to add a couple points of clarification. So as Rick said, we will have another call or another webinar to discuss the terms and definitions and criteria for the evaluation and the technical assistant grants. And then ODA is required to actually hold its own rule writing committee meeting to discuss the farm to school infrastructure and equipment grants. And so that meeting is scheduled for September 30th. So some of you may be getting an invitation for that, and that will be coming shortly. The other thing I wanted to point out was that the way we're going to do this today is Rick and I are going to take turns going through these agenda items, and then there will be a Q&A or a discussion section after each of the agenda items. So when you do have questions, when we do get to that point in the agenda, we'll open the line and you'll be able to ask your question if you're calling in from a phone. If you'd like, you can go ahead at that time and add your comment or your question or your feedback into the chat box. And so we'll start looking at the chat box at that time. So we won't be monitoring the chat box until we get to that point in the agenda. So just a point of clarification about the process today. And then if everybody, just as a reminder, if everyone could please mute their phones or mute their computers during the discussion, that would be great. And I'll turn it back to Rick.
I can see this.
Oh, all right. Do you want to use that one?
Okay. All right. So we're on time still, I believe. And so the first section we wanted to talk about was definition of the Oregon Farm to School procurement and education grants eligible entities and terms. So right now, the first bullet point, if those of you who are watching along, if you're on your phone just listening, it's the legislator expanded types of entities that can receive non-competitive and competitive education grant. So we have to talk about the types of entities that can receive the grant. We have to define the provider of center-based programs for children in the CACFP, and that's for both the procurement and the education grants. We have to have a meals definition thing because we used to base the procurement grant on lunches, but now we're doing meals, and so we need to define that. Then we need to define providers of center-based program for children in CACFP and producers that are eligible to apply for the competitive education grants. And then the last thing we have to talk about is defining producers of food processed in the state, including farmers, ranchers, and seafood harvesters. We just have to define that. These are new. Some of these are new terms. So again, I think the first bullet, we'll go back to legislators expanded the types of entities that can receive non-competitive and competitive education grants. Thank you. And where is that? Bear with me as I find yeah. So the first, again, we defined a lot of this in rules last year. Last year we had, for the non-competitive procurement grant, school districts are eligible. And the newly added right under that is a provider of center-based programs for children. Oh, can you please mute your lines, please?
And that's small, like a cherry tomato, but it's kind of yellow.
Okay.
We good?
I think that'd be
Okay.
Yeah.
I think we just muted everybody. So, okay, here we go. So a school district is already, we don't have to define that because we've already done that. But one of the things we have to define is a provider of center-based programs for children in the child and adult food care program. And so we just talk about that right now. So center-based programs are, we could define as not serving adults because the focus of this is children, even though it's child and adult food care program. But the process of this grant is specifically for the children. So we wanted to not have adult centers, which I believe there were only 5 out of the 300 and so CACFP. So not too many of them there. The other thing I think we were talking about were camps and, I'm sorry. Oh, a center-based program is a provider, means a child care center certified by the Oregon Child Care, a Head Start Center, an Oregon pre-kindergarten program, a school district, or an education service district, ESD, that both provides non-residential child care services to enrolled children and participates in the federal child and adult food care program. Boom. So thank you, Matt. Matt is the guy that gives me all the definitions and stuff. So there we go. There's that. Do you want to, we'll talk about that at the end of the bullets then, or?
Mhm.
So if you guys have a comment of that, type it in and we'll open it up at the end of this section for more comments. But that was the official definition for the CACFP folks in there. So, okay. And then the next one was, is that this? Okay, so that was the center-based programs. We got that. The meal definition, we want to touch on that. So this was kind of a neat thing that I think we figured out how to do. So in the Department of Education Child Nutrition Programs, we have a thing called meal equivalents we use sometimes, and it kind of levels the playing fields because some people only do snacks, some people only do breakfast, most people do a combination of all of them. And so comparing apples to oranges isn't really that fair because a snack doesn't cost that much. It's not that big of a thing. Breakfasts are smaller than lunches or whatever. So how we define that is lunches are 1 meal. Breakfast is 2 to 1 meal. So if you had 10 breakfasts, it would be 5 meals. And then snacks are at 4 to 1. So for every 4 snacks, it's 1 meal. So when I get everybody's, and I'm working on this as we speak, it should be done today or tomorrow, but I'm working on everybody's awards. I'm looking at the lunches, breakfasts and snacks and suppers, and that includes some summer lunches too as well. So I take all those and figured that formula. So that will be, we will figure out a snappy definition for that, but that meals definition will be the meal equivalent formula of that: lunches, breakfasts, and snacks. Lunches being 1 for 1, breakfast 2 to 1, snacks 4 for 1.
Hey, Rick, just a question. That meals definition you mentioned, and this is Matt Barber, by the way, just because nobody can see who the disembodied voice belongs to. But that meals definition you were talking about, is that something we developed in-house, or is that something we're kind of borrowing from the feds? Because that sounds like something they do with their programs.
That is a good, I know I didn't invent that. That was something that was ODE child nutrition programs. I know when I was a part of food service management companies, we use that formula for billing and stuff, billing meals and things. So that, they defined a meal that way. And so when I pitched it, they all said, yeah, we already use that in other things. So I don't know if I think it is a federal thing too, but I'm not sure.
So at least it's established and people should be familiar with this.
Some people should, not everybody.
Right.
It's to be honest, it's brand new for most of the people here. But there's a few people out there that might, oh yeah, it's a thing we do. So thank you for the question. Okay, so that was meal definitions. And then,
And do you want to say why that was necessary?
Well, yeah, just because it's to compare lunches versus snacks. If somebody only did snacks or only did breakfast or whatever. It's not. There's a fairness issue in comparing apples to oranges, and I think it levels the playing field, and and you're able to count everybody's meals. But if like for instance, there's a school district that did 100,000 lunches, and then another district that just did 100,000 snacks, and we're able to count them the same, it wouldn't be the same thing, because snacks could be like some crackers and a juice or whatever. Whatever it is. I mean the snack meal pattern.
But the reason that we came up with this ratio, Rick, is because now the award chip is going to be determined by
Right.
meals and not only lunch counts, right?
Right.
So making
Correct.
sure that the districts on the call
That is
understand
correct.
that difference. That
Yes.
the reward may
That is correct.
be greater. Oh, she
Uh,
wants to see the definition of the CACFP. Do you have the OER number for that?
It's actually the definition we've developed internally for provider of center-based programs for children. We haven't actually published it in an Oregon administrative rule yet. We have developed it as a proposed temporary rule that the board is going to be considering, where we're doing a quick amendment to the current farm to school rules to add some of these new eligible entities.
Mhm.
But Rick, you've got a copy of these. Can you make these available?
I can make these. I can make these available. We will be able to put the notes for this on the website, on the grant website, and we could put a link to this recording there as well. Hopefully, it'll be accessible and everything. We have to deal with that issue of making this accessible for the hearing impaired. But we'll figure out how to do that with our new system and do that. And we'll have, as Matt is drafting, help us draft the definitions, that will go on there too. And so we'll have updates of like what we're doing with the State Board of Education. That'll go on there too. We'll have a rulemaking section on the website very shortly, within a week, I'll say.
And if you check the State Board of Education's page on the ODE website, they have something called Board Book, I think it is, where you can see the agenda and materials they're going to be looking at for their upcoming meeting in September. In a couple of days, all of the materials should be posted to that Board Book site, including the proposed temporary rules with the definition for provider of center-based programs for children. Will be further, I mean, this isn't set in stone. I mean, this is just for purposes of the temp rules. If we're hearing more comments from you guys, we can make modifications as needed.
And so just I had a quick question since we're talking about the lunches to meals. Actually, we weren't.
We should wait until we get through let's get through the bullets and then we can go to the questions.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. Let's do that. So I'm going to move on now to the next bullet. Providers of center-based program for children in CACFP and producers are eligible to apply for the competitive grants. So one thing is we might have to define competitive grants as new. Okay, so that's that. No, I'm sorry, hang on. The competitive education grant is not new, but the CACFP, which might include, make sure you would put in summer, right? Summer programs.
Right.
Most of the summer programs are in the CACFP under that umbrella, but I think they got left off in the bill. But CACFP, summer, and producers are eligible to apply for the competitive education grant. And again, the caveat is as long as they still have to follow the same guidelines specified in the bill of, they have to fill out an RFA and qualify by, working with school districts. We're not going to give, like for instance, producers money and let, they're eligible just like a nonprofit would be, or a tribal organization or whatever. So if they're working in schools that are participate in the child nutrition programs, any child nutrition programs, they could do that. So it'll be the same criteria, but we're just putting in producers. So Amy, producers, what could those what those mean?
So the language in the bill is producers of food produced or processed in this state, including farmers, ranchers, and seafood harvesters, will be eligible for the competitive education funds. So we are, we're following that. Essentially, we're following that that definition. We probably will include. We'll probably include. We probably won't include, I guess I should say, distributors and processors. But the intention, I believe, of this of this of this portion of the bill is so that producers, individual producers who participate in educational activities related to educating kids about food and agriculture and nutrition education could potentially apply for those funds and could continue to perform certain activities that they regularly do, whether that's having children out to the farm for field trips, possibly coming to the school for some sort of farmer engagement or presentation. So I think those are some of the things that we're originally thinking about, some of the things that we've seen in the grant proposals themselves in terms of how past education grants have been spent to support producer engagement. There's also certain agricultural curricula that, for example, agriculture in the classroom. We do have some producers who participate in some of those different curriculum and are more engaged than others. So we'd want to make sure those producers are eligible as well.
Okay, and that was, those two bullets went from one to the other, so.
All right, so let's open it up for a discussion and question and answer on this segment of some of the terms and definitions that we've just described, that Rick's described. I'm going to unmute the line.
Take the first one from Debbie here.
Hang on just a second. Let me get all the. Okay, everybody's now unmuted on our end. So first we're going to take the chat box questions and then we'll open up the line for anyone that has a question via phone.
Okay, the question we had about meal definitions, will suppers be included? Yes, and lunch numbers. What if we do CACFP and NSLP meals from the both to be included? Yes, so what I did is I got our Jeremy, our data guy, to give me all the numbers for last year, and we will go through and get all the child and adult food care lunches, all the suppers, all the snacks, all the breakfasts, and yeah, so they'll be they will be all combined together. Now, there's a lot of questions. Sometimes there's some very subtle changes in programs, and a sponsor usually has a dedicated sponsor number. And where I get confused is where, like, some school district has a sponsor, shares the same sponsor number with somebody else, and there's different food program coordinators or food service directors. I'll probably combine them, or I'll end up giving the director a call. The other thing about that is everybody's going to get at least $500 to start. So a very, very small program sometimes would get $40, which didn't make a lot of sense. And so we were going to start everybody out at 500, and then once that threshold is met, we go up from there. Everyone will get at least the same amount that they got last session, if not a little bit more. And we anticipate to have another bank of dollars set aside for a competitive portion that people could apply to get more, which we'll do later. But right now, we just wanted to get started with the grant. So answer to your question, that yes, all meals will be included.
I don't know, there's another question here from Maureen.
Okay. Can you clarify how a summer program that serves youth can be eligible for a procurement grant? So far, I haven't seen where a summer camp fits into that definition. So that's,
Can you ask her to clarify what she means by summer camp?
Well, this is Matt. Summer food service program participants weren't included in the entities that were added to those who are eligible for the competitive education grant.
Right.
They just added providers of center-based programs for children and the producers of food, producer processed work. Summer food service providers were added to the non-competitive procurement grant, and the entities that can participate in the summer food service program are public or private schools, public or private nonprofit residential summer camps, and other types of entities. So
other types of entities.
Right. So if you're a public or private nonprofit residential summer camp and you're already approved to participate in summer food service program, you could apply for a non-competitive procurement grant.
Okay. So that is the term based on that other entities that might be able to do that. We've noted it for the question written for Maureen. So I'll make sure that we consider it. And so I might have to double. I doubt if they're good.
Okay, we have a question from Sheila with Rogue Valley Farm to School. If farmers are providing education programs in collaboration with the nonprofit, can both apply separately for competitive
I
grants?
can answer that. Yeah, thank you for the question. They could, but not for the same work. They would have to, we wouldn't want it to be duplicative. So, like for instance, if Joe's Farm and a nonprofit were working with a school district on the same program, that might be problematic. A lot of times what people will do, they will apply together and then work out, how the money benefits both. Like sometimes a nonprofit will hire Joe's Farm and then pay a farmer for a farm field trip. Something like that, that would work out under one single application. But if they wanted to apply for separate things, it'd be better to not duplicate things, as that might be a little confusing. And also the selection committee likes to move things around a little bit, so they like to fund things in different areas. And so I'm just speculating here, but because I've been on the selection committee the last 8 years, I'm actually lead it. I don't vote, but if they see two applications funding the same thing, they're probably going to pick one of them, right? So just as a little advice. So they like to see different things, different areas, different schools. We have more money now to go around, which is good. We can open it up to some other areas that typically haven't been served, like school districts with lower free and reduced, or lower free and reduced, I guess is the right term. But there's
good. Come on, introducing myself. This will be out of Albany. We supply our nonprofits and churches here with cost-effective machines.
Is that a question? I don't think that was a question. Okay. All right. So that was our last question there. Any other questions? Feel free to throw them in the chat box, or you can send me an email if you're shy. That's okay, and I can answer them later or take them into consideration if you just have a comment.
Okay, and then I'm going to open everybody's lines. If anybody is calling in from a phone and wants to ask a question or make a comment, please go ahead and do so now. Okay. I just wanted to, I actually overlooked a note I wanted to make about defining the producers who are eligible for the competitive education grants that I wanted to make sure I mentioned. And that is that the way we will determine eligibility is if a producer owns, leases, or rents land for cultivation, a business license, or a fisheries registry. And so those are some of the existing definitions that we use at ODA to determine if someone is a producer. And then, so if anybody has comments about that, or we'll also be defining that in the rule writing for the ODA infrastructure and equipment grants. We'll be covering that as well. But that's some of the basic definitions that we use. Okay, Rick.
Okay, next section is for non-competitive procurement grant rules. And so before we were talking about eligible entities and terms, but now we're just talking about some rules that we need to address. Very short, only 3 bullets. The first one we're going to talk about is we're adding CHCFP, providers of center-based programs again, just like what Matt talked about before. New allowable costs in the non-competitive grant program. Section 1-2-A of the Enroll Bill added costs incurred to identify sources of Oregon foods or to process Oregon foods. So we needed to define that. So really, it's only those 2 things. So okay. So the first bullet added CACFP, providers of center-based programs. Again, it would be that same definition that we did before. And I'm not even going to read that again because we've all been through that again. So that's the story we're going with there. So adding the child and adult food care providers in that section. And the other thing is, and I'll read that how it's written in the bill. It says, okay, where is it? Show me again that. Section 1 and 2A, cost to identify sources. Oh, right there. Okay, so produce or process in the state. So, okay, so we could basically it's going to say an entity that receives a grant under this subsection shall use the monies for the costs incurred by the entity to purchase products that were produced or processed in the state, including to pay for costs incurred to identify sources of those foods or process those foods. So basically, what needs to be defined here, it's like the word costs. And so we can't say any cost. Like for instance, like I identified a source for you to get a case of hamburgers, and I'm going to charge you $10,000 for it. So it has to be a reasonable cost. So we'll talk about this later down below, but we're suggesting that it shouldn't be more than 20% of the total cost of the sponsor's allotment. They have a 20% amount to go with. And so we want to keep it reasonable and under that limit for there. And so we're going to talk about that some more there, but Matt, did you have something? Right. Oh, right. We didn't have that in here yet, did we?
That's in the temporary rules.
The monies to provide. Hang on a second. We're sidebarring a little bit. This part we didn't put in. That. So, because the education for this is still in the procurement, in the non-competitive procurement. Okay, and one other thing that this isn't on your notes anywhere, but an added bullet here. Sorry about that. We missed this one, but this is a new thing that's in here. may use monies to provide education or promotion about foods produced or processed in the state. So a lot of you might be thinking that sounds like an education grant thing. So what we decided to do this time is basically for those people that aren't successful in getting an education grant, they can still use some of their money to provide educational activities in the procurement side. And the suggestion is, again, you have up to 20% of your funds to play with there. So you're encouraged to do, you can do up to 100% for procurement, but you may use 20% for other items is what we're going for. And that would include things like identifying costs, identifying sources for costs, and using monies to provide education or promotion about foods or produce or process in the state. Okay, so yeah, but we forgot to type that in there. So we want to make sure that we have that captured. Okay.
There's a question about traditional
Okay.
farming and harvesting.
Okay, so let's see, are there any questions? Looks like we have some questions from the last section, so we're going to answer those in just a minute. Are there any questions about some of the changes in either the eligible entities for the non-competitive procurement grant or any of the newly allowable costs, such as some of the ones that Rick mentioned, particularly around promotion and education of the products that schools are serving? Does anybody have any question about those? Please type those in your chat box. Your lines are also open, so if you do have a question, you can also ask via phone.
This is Megan Kemple. I have 2 questions. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Can you clarify if your recommendation right now, your suggestion is to have 20% for both education and promotion and sourcing, or 20% for each?
Yeah, I think the intent of the procurement grant is to do procurement. So it's 20, would be no more than 20% total for anything not procurement.
Okay, and then my second question is, can you tell us what the process is for determining how much funding is available for this grant program?
For the education?
Total.
Hang on a second.
I'm specifically wondering whether it's part of the rulemaking process at all or something that the agency will do separately.
So Megan, sorry, I was just double checking some things, but no, it's not determined through rulemaking. So we're not going to address that right here. No.
Okay, any other questions about the non-competitive procurement grant rules section? All right, so let's back up here. We've got a few other questions about, let's see, starting with Melina's. Melina asks, in terms of defining producers, what about traditional hunting and harvesting?
Like with muskets
So,
or?
so we do have, I do have a tribal, so we do, Christina Higbee in the ODA director's office is our tribal liaison. And so she is going to be looking over some of these definitions, but we also are trying to, right now we're in the process of trying to find we have a couple of recommendations from some of our partners for tribal producers to serve on the ODA infrastructure grant and on that committee. And I think, and I'll talk to Matt, but I think maybe we can probably define this in that committee, define the producers that are eligible in one or the other committees, right?
Right, and ODE has its own tribal liaison that will be getting involved in this process as we get into permanent rulemaking. One thing we do, I mean, assuming this is about the procurement, the non-competitive procurement, is we do have to be aware that those people participating in the National School Lunch, School Breakfast, those federal programs, the foods that come in will have to still meet the applicable food safety standards for those programs. So, I mean, the meat or any food that comes in might still need to be.
Right, but I think that she's talking about, Melina, I believe you're talking about those that could be eligible for the education funds. Not so, I mean, these aren't necessarily producers who have product that is,
right, yeah, for the
it's
education.
not approved for schools in general
Yeah,
because they can't hunt, right?
Right,
Usually
yeah,
that's not something they can do. So I think this is more about some, producers that might do some hunting and gathering and maybe want to come in and talk to.
Yeah, because if it was for the producer or the procurement grant, whatever they sell has to be USDA inspected and all that
Well,
stuff.
the slaughter would have to be individually inspected.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh,
yes, Melina says yes, education part of procurement.
Thank you.
From Sheila.
Okay, so then Sheila, sure, do you want to read that one, Rick?
So Sheila from Rogue Valley says, so as a nonprofit, we wanted to seek funding to support minimal processing. Would we be better off asking the schools to use their non-competitive funding to fund us, or would we be better applying for funding ourselves? We would also be applying for a competitive education grant. That's a really interesting situation. You could go a couple different ways on that. Like, yes, in your area, for instance, like Ashland School District, they could use up to 20% of their funds, was what we're recommending again. So to buy Robocoos or mandolins or labor to minimally process food, like to chop up carrots and things like that. So we had some success with that in the last biennium. It was pretty neat. So people did that. They paid for labor. And so that if they're paying for labor, if that means they're working with you guys to do that, that's something that could be done as long as it's, justified and everything. But or if they're doing that themselves, or you guys could certainly do that in the education grant as long as you're teaching kids. Like if you're teaching kids how to, that's farm-based, ag-based, food-based educational activities. As long as you're teaching kids about that, then that would be acceptable too. So, but that for an education grant is not meant for food processing. That's not going to fly. But there's a creative way you could do that. So you could go a couple different ways on that. So good luck. And then
the other thing I just wanted to quickly mention in relationship to Melina's question earlier about producers who hunt or harvest food, who may not otherwise be captured in our definition. So the other thing to keep in mind is that federally recognized tribes and schools that are overseen by the Bureau of Indian Education are also eligible for those the competitive education grants. So just something to keep in mind as well.
Anna has a question that you might want. That's something I've never heard before. So that's very good. Good question.
Okay, and then Anna Garwood has a question. Would it be possible to have some labor and environmental standards for farms receiving state funding through the non-competitive and competitive procurement grants? For example, exclude producers that are not in compliance with BLI, OSHA, or EPA, and or have a system to give a higher reimbursement rate for farms with certified labor or environmental standards, and or incentivize purchasing from minority-owned farms. I'm concerned that just because of farmer processors in the state that they may not have good labor or environmental practices. So that is, can you hold on just a second? Okay. Okay, so a couple of questions inside that question from Anna. The first one we'll address is in terms of, we are able to provide preference for women or minority-owned businesses, or socially, as the USDA would define, socially disadvantaged farmers or businesses. That is something that is that ODA and the state could follow, and we could, in fact, incentivize, or not necessarily incentivize that, but we could award more points or preferences in an application that came from a producer, both for the education grants as well as the procurement grants. In terms of labor or environmental practices, it is possible that we could provide a preference for certain levels of certification, such as I'm sort of blanking on some, but salmon safe, or I don't know exactly what labor standards we would use, but we could definitely look into that as preferences. I guess we could look at it both from the food that they're producing as well as their environmental and labor practices. So it is possible that we could build that into a point system for applications. And we have a question from Jordan. Will there be another opportunity for organizations to opt into the non-competitive procurement funding? Specifically, she's wondering about a potential for new summer food service program sites that would operate during summer 2020.
Yeah, there's we're going to talk maybe a little bit further down about some CACFP, the term seriously deficient and stuff. So there are some folks that aren't participating right now that might have an opportunity to later. The good news is we won't mark all of the money, the whole entire pot right off the bat, so we'll have some set aside. And the numbers we're talking about are very, very small. For those of you that don't know, we just went through an exercise this last week. We were able to opt in everybody that was eligible automatically. And so there will be some people that won't participate. Just knowing how this goes, that we will reallocate, which means we'll take money back and reallocate it. But then we still have this other pot of money for the competitive part of the procurement grant that people can apply for. And some of these other people that you talked about, I mean, new sponsors, which would include that, like New Summer 2020, then that makes sense. That they could do that. So yes, we would be able to do that. I don't think necessarily we need to create a rule around that, though. It's not. It's something that we could just do in practice, though. So I guess I didn't need to get in all that. I could have just said it's not part of the rule, but yeah, we will be able to do that. Okay, that was our last question. There. And then you are going to take the next two sections.
All right, we're going to move on. Unless there's if you have a question or something comes to mind, just drop it in the chat box and we'll pick it up when we can. We're going to turn now to the competitive procurement grant rules. So as you know, for those of you that have read the bill, one of the new grant programs is a competitive procurement grant that will be awarded to eligible entities to encourage and sustain efforts to purchase or promote Oregon-produced or processed foods. And so this includes the eligible entities for the competitive procurement grant are schools that are participating in the National School Lunch Program, also the providers of center-based programs through CACFP, and for those that are not in those two, so individually, summer food service programs, those sponsors are also eligible for these competitive funds. So there is, so one of the other areas that we need to cover for this new grant program is similar to the allowable costs in the previous section under the under the non-competitive procurement grant. So we have a suggested similar limitation of up to 20% of total competitive procurement funds that can be used for costs, such as the ones that Rick discussed earlier, related to any personnel time, such as their own, school districts or SFSP or CACFP's time spent researching local products, sourcing local products, mileage for travel to pick up those products. Any of the small kitchen appliances, Rick mentioned a few of those, would also be eligible within this 20% limitation, as well as any education or promotion that these sponsors wanted to do at the point of consumption or point of sale, such as in the cafeterias or the summer meal sites of Oregon foods eligible for procurement reimbursements. So we'd like to match those limitations in each of the procurement grants for consistency and clarity among our sponsors. Do we have anything else around that we need to share? And then we need to define the competitive process to encourage and sustain successful efforts to purchase or promote food produced or processed in the state. Rick and I have developed a set of eligibility criteria. This is not an all-inclusive set, and some of these have actually been vetted with some of our other state agency counterparts and sort of mirror what's being done in other parts of the country with their incentive-based programs for procurement, including Michigan, New York, Colorado, and New Mexico, have very similar criteria for participation in their competitive procurement grants. So I'll just read through these, and then if people have questions, we can talk about them. One of them is we would like that to be eligible for this competitive grant, that you must be participating in the non-competitive procurement grant. We also would like to see a demonstrated track record or history of excellent performance in the non-competitive procurement grant. So past participation, I realize that we'll need to determine how any of these newly eligible sponsors, how they would fit these criteria. But we'd like to see a demonstrated diverse purchases from multiple vendors, and we'd like to see some consistency in timely meeting the reporting requirements under the procurement grant. That's a really important one, and especially as we now have a mandate to have an evaluation for the program, that's going to be very important. We'd also like to see that they have a demonstrated plan or submit a plan to us to source directly from producers and processors in their entity's region. This may be where we can award more points for certain qualities or characteristics of those producers, as mentioned previously on the call. And then also we'd like to see some level of engagement with regional producers to promote products in those meal programs, as we all know about the importance of tying education into procurement. We'd also like to use a common record-keeping tool among this set of procurement grantees for tracking all of their Oregon purchases. And we've also discussed requiring that they already achieve some percentage of their food purchases, either in quantity or in dollar amounts of Oregon purchases, to be eligible for these funds. Is there anything that you guys want to add?
Nope, that's a good start.
Okay, so let's go to the chat box if there are questions about this section.
Maureen has two. She has
These from Maureen. Okay.
The second one might be better.
All right, Maureen has a question here. If a school contracts with a nonprofit to conduct promotion and or education as part of the 20% of non-competitive procurement, can that nonprofit charge for administrative costs? So marine, so that is something that that would not be something, I guess, that we'd work out in a rule, but is something that we can talk about in the RFA. Actually, or actually, I'm sorry, not the RFA, but that's something we probably have to talk about with whether or not the district can, what the district would have to do to be reimbursed for paying for those funds, because how they do that now, well, they do that with an invoice now, so it may be,
Yeah.
I'm not sure how they would do that, but we could talk about that. Might be more of an administrative issue. So,
But thanks, we got your comment.
we got the comment.
Yep.
That's the important part. Sheila asked, "What will be the size of the competitive procurement grants?" We don't know, and we aren't able. That's not part of the rule writing process, and we don't actually know
I
what
could
the
say
amounts are.
I could say last year what they were, the size of them.
Well,
but
we didn't have them last year. This is the competitive procurement grant.
right. All competitive, right?
So some of it will depend on who opts out, because we've gone into an all opt-in process. And so it really depends on what that, once we complete that process, what the pool looks like. But we really can't say,
And plus, honestly, it's not part of the rule process anyway. We don't need to establish a rule about the size. So,
Okay, what else? Megan Kimball, related to Sheila. Okay, she was, all right, and then Angela Hedstrom seconding Anna's question or comment above regarding the competitive procurement grant to include prioritizing farmers of color, labor considerations, and culturally relevant foods. Okay, great, we have that down. Megan Temple is asking about what is the process for determining minimum and maximum grant award amounts?
for the competitive procurement, we don't have that yet.
We don't know that there is a process for determining the minimum and maximum grant award amounts in terms of public input through rule writing. That's something we'll have to talk about with the administrators, and whether or not that's something that the agency decides. I don't think it's decided through the rules. I mean, that's not what we've talked about. But you want to chime in on that? There's a question about what is the process for determining minimum and maximum grant award amounts?
That is not currently something that's part of the rules laying out the non-competitive procurement grant or the competitive education grant. If during the rulemaking advisory committee process, somebody wants to bring that up for discussion, that can certainly be a topic of discussion.
And right now I'm thinking that would be arbitrary by me to decide that, just to do that. And how we started way back when we started the competitive grants, we didn't know what we didn't know, so we just went ahead and let proposals come in, and then we started. Again, this is back in the day when things were procurement and education combined, competitive grants. And then we started establishing limits, like a minimum of 2,000, maximum of 100,000 average. And so we still do that by practice for the education grant. But I think we're going to have to wait and see. A lot of it has to determine with how much pots of money we're using with after we have the non-competitive part, after everybody opts in, and they have, and I determine the awards, which I'm almost done with, then we'll know how much of the money we have left over. And so it depends. So I couldn't answer that right now and make a rule about it, because we don't know.
And I'm sorry, but I misspoke. We do actually have some caps. It's on the competitive education.
Yes.
017-0444.
Do you want me to put that in here?
Minimum of 2,000, no more than 100.
Right.
Competitive education grant.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, we have
put it in here.
But we didn't establish that for a few years.
Sorry, I'm just going to mute the line for 1 second. We're going to put the OAR in for the grant limitation, so everybody has it. Just a second. Okay, so I just went ahead and added the minimum and maximum grant limit for the competitive education grant, which is the only one by state statute that we do have a minimum for and a maximum for, which is at least, as Matt said, $2,000 and no more than $100,000. And then Rick discussed some of the other considerations that we'll have to review for setting minimum and maximums for the other grants once we know more about the opt-in pool, and then how the competitive procurement grant will be structured. Okay, let's see. Melina Barker has a question about the process. So what is the process and timeline for giving feedback about suggested criteria? You want to take that one, Matt?
Yeah.
Or how long will we take feedback and comments on the proposed rules?
Is there a deadline?
Right. So that'll be announced a little bit later. There will be once we've started with the paperwork to get the rulemaking started. We've got our advisory committee going. There will be a period for public comment. So if you can make your comments known during the advisory committee meetings, or if you don't want to do that, or you have like a shower thought that only comes to you when you're driving home or in the bathtub, you can submit that after the advisory committee meetings are over, but before the period for public comment ends. We can also accept public comment on proposed rules when they're before the State Board of Education. If you want to come to attend a State Board of Education meeting, there's a public comment period. You can offer public comment on the rules then. So these 3 opportunities.
But for right now, we're going to get this stuff up on our website within the next week. You could look at it and submit comments to me through email, and we can add them. And then I think when does our first docket? When are we on the first?
Our first docket for pharma school rules is actually this month, but that's for the temporary rules that we're doing just to get the current rules up to where the revised statute is. We do not yet have a date
for the other ones. Okay.
The others.
Okay, so we don't have a date, Melina, but you could, but within the next week, we will get this up there, and I would get comments in sooner rather than later when they show up, if you have more.
Okay. Right. You want to take that? There's another question.
Amy Gillen. The next one I see is from Amy Gillen. Wait.
Oh, from
No,
Gara.
you just put that thing on Gara. Okay. Can a single district apply for multiple competitive grants? And I'm assuming you're talking about the competitive education grant here. Yes, there is nothing to preclude you to doing that. We did have an entity. They were successful in getting 2 different grants for 2 different operations for 2 different school districts. I was thinking in the past, Oregon Ag in the Classroom. They did something with Oregon Beef in one school in Hillsborough, and then they did another one with schools in Washington County. So they were able to do that, but they were totally different, and they just it was so you could do that, but you just run the risk of like I said, you don't want to be duplicative and do the same thing. The committee tends to they don't like to award if there's 2 very, very similar programs in the very same area. That might not work out. Although we have more money this time, so there's that. So there's nothing to stop you from doing that. No.
And Aaron Poplack has a question about submitting comments about rulemaking.
Is there a formal way to submit? Well, right now we're submitting comments on this process through email or the chat box right now, and we will include those with but like what Matt was talking about, once these rules get drafted and we put our recommendations, to the State Board of Education. That's what he was talking about. They do have a formal process for public input on that. And that would be forthcoming. We could post that on our rulemaking section on our grant webpage. We'll do that. I don't have that right now.
No, we don't have the exact dates yet, but we can make that available on the website as Rick mentioned.
So let's see, we don't have.
And the reason we don't have exact dates yet is because one, we're not currently scheduled for a rulemaking process with the State Board of Education. But once we get the paperwork going, we'll have dates for getting comments through these rulemaking committee meetings that we're having. We'll be able to announce when the deadline is for submitting public comment, and we'll be able to announce when the board is going to hear the rules and we can make comment then too. And you can send emails to Rick. You can send emails to Amy. You can leave voicemail messages, carrier pigeons. Please don't send carrier pigeons.
No, why not?
But there's a lot of ways you can make public comment. And we do want to get your comments on these rules so that we can make sure that they're as good as they can be and serve the community they're served.
Okay. We go to the last section.
Okay. All right. Any further questions as they come up? Please just put them in the chat box. And the last section we have is a couple of tweaks to the competitive education grant program. We did expand the bill expanded the eligible entities under the education grants to include the provider or the center-based, the CACFP providers, as well as producers, as we discussed earlier. Something that was overlooked in the bill was SFSP sponsors, but we are going to make sure that they are included in the way the rules are written. So those that are independent of CACFP will also be included as an eligible entity for those funds. The other change to this section was there was quite a bit of feedback from a number of our education grantees over the past couple of biennium that having some resources and support from the grant funding to pay for coordination and implementation activities or duties under the grant would be really helpful. So that change was made for this new biennium. And so we have some suggested language that Matt and Rick and I have worked on to define coordination and implementation activities for those activities that are included in educating kids about food and agriculture and garden-based learning in a school district. And those are coordination. It can include, but is not limited to, researching best practices, writing and preparing lesson plans, gathering any relevant materials, and general administration of the project under the grant. Implementation includes, but is not limited to, delivering those educational activities, again, in a school setting, and then cost of any supplies or garden materials, maybe curriculum booklets, anything like that that you might need for some of the programming. It's also suggested that no more than 20% of the total grant award may be billed for the purpose of coordination and implementation. So I will stop there and go to the chat box. If you have questions about this section, clarifications, feedback, please go ahead and submit it in the chat box, or you're also the lines are open and you're also able to just ask via phone as well.
I got the first one.
Okay, do you want to read it out?
Yep. Gara asks, can we purchase food with the education grant for the educational activity? Yes, definitely you can. You can also purchase things like, I won't get into it right now. But yeah, you can purchase food that, but we don't need to make a rule about that.
And typically the food is used for, and this is something that we've also followed from the USDA guidelines for some of their farm to school grant programs. But the food is usually for samples or for taste testing, and is tied to those educational activities. So it doesn't include meals. Did we just get kicked off? What happened?
I don't know. Nope, we're on.
Okay, and then from Melina, we have a question. Melina asks, not sure if now is the appropriate time to suggest this, but would you consider a tiered approach to education grants? One track with larger grant amounts to expand successful model programs, and one track for startup or smaller schools or programs. That would decrease competition between support organizations and individual schools, and I believe it would make grant applications more successful. So that's a good.
Yep, that's something we don't need to address by rule. We could do by practice. So we could do that in the RFA. I've already finished with our first set of drafts for the RFA, and Amy and I are going to start getting into that next. And that's something we can think of for that. So we have your comment, Melina, and I think that comment needs to be, we need to cut and paste that and think of that when we're looking at our RFA draft. But yeah, we don't need to adjust that by rule. And then the next question from Megan. You suggested no more than 20% of total grant award may be billed to coordination and implementation, but I think you mean 20% for coordination. Implementation would be the remainder. That is a good point, yes. So think of it this way, and we can wordsmith that if we have that in there. We'll make sure we take it out of the notes, but 20%, I'm sorry, no more than 20% can be used for things that aren't implementation or activity related, okay? And that means everything else is like your overhead or just planning. Unless planning is part of the activity, then you can do it that way. And that's the same for the procurement grant. Those extra things, just going to be a flat 20%. Last time in the rules, we had a more complicated system in the rules, like up to 10%, up to 20%, and that got almost impossible to enforce and to track. And so it just makes a lot more sense to do 20%. So that's what we're going for that. But implementation could mean activities, yes, definitely. So.
All right, we've got those notes down. Thanks for that clarification. All right, any further questions about the competitive education grant at this time? We'll just we'll sit here for about 30 seconds. If people have questions, go ahead and type them in the chat box. We're gonna mute you and be right back.
So.
Hello.
Okay, everybody, hello again. While we're waiting for you guys to type in last comments, there's one more thing I need to address that we haven't put as a bullet point that I need to, and I thought we got it in there. But now that we've let the child and adult food care program in, There's the term of seriously deficient we need to address. We need to define that. That's in our agreements through them, and that's a thing. That's a actual term that's being used, and it was kind of new on me. In the National School Lunch Program, child nutrition programs, we have a term called in good standing. And basically, I got some clarification on this, but in the NSLP, we haven't kicked anybody out of the NSLP in the 20 years or so. And that's because like school lunch are in school districts, and school districts are required by federal law to have audits, federal audits every year, and there aren't as many surprises. They usually have dedicated food service directors, whatnot. But in the CACFP program, that's not the case. It could be a very small operation where a PE coach is the food program coordinator, and they're very small. They're not required to have audits, and so things happen every year. So this year we had 8 programs that were dropped. And so, those terms are called seriously deficient. And there's actually a CFR for that, and Matt can type this into the rules, but it's a USDA thing that's meaning the status of an institution on a daycare home that has been determined to be non-compliant in one or more aspects of the operation of the program. So CACFP participants designated as seriously deficient must undergo a process to address their non-compliance with the program's requirements. And so we have a link about that and everything. So we have 8 programs that were kicked out, and if it was decided that if you're in one program and you're seriously deficient, you're not eligible for the grant. Like if you're a school district and you have a CACFP and they found you seriously deficient, then that school district isn't eligible to apply. Now we know who those guys are, and we've already earmarked them and stuff. So we just have to figure out a time when they can be let back in. We don't know that yet, and so
that process would rely on our CACFP team here at ODE to go to work that program sponsor through that process. Yep. And once they've indicated that program sponsor is no longer seriously deficient, then they notify Rick.
Thank you. So that's when that happens, but it's not like after so many months. They just have to work through those issues to be let back in, and then I can let them back in. So, but I know our procurement, when I was drafting the agreements, we have to draft an agreement for every one of these people, like a nonprofit, CACFP, summer program, their addendum agreements. And so I had seriously deficient in there, and they like, what's this? And so we had to tell them it's a thing. And so we have to address it by rules. So I did that. Done.
Okay, so we have a couple questions in the chat box. Aaron Poplak has a question, probably for you, Matt. Will there be a formal process for submitting comments on the request for application development for the grants, as it will occur after rulemaking? It would be helpful to have a clear timeline for all of the places where there will be an opportunity for public input on aspects of the grant, from rulemaking to implementation, with methods for submitting comment at each stage posted on the ODE website.
Aaron, thanks for that question. Typically what happens is that there's public input during the rulemaking process, just like there is during the legislative process. And we will post the timelines for that on Rick's website. But in terms of developing a request for applications or a request for proposals, we typically don't open that up to public input. Those are usually developed after the statute's in place and the rules have been adopted. So if you want to get involved in public input, please make sure you share your comments with us during the rulemaking process, so we can have those when we're developing the RFA internally.
And then just the other comment that Matt made earlier, Aaron, which I don't know if you heard, but the paperwork has not been filed or submitted to the Board of Education yet. So therefore, unfortunately, we don't really have those concrete dates for the entire public input process for the temporary and final rules.
The temporary paperwork has been filed. It was filed yesterday.
Oh,
So the temporary rules will be on the docket for the September State Board of Education meeting. Um, you can offer public comment at that meeting if you want. The temporary rules are much less involved than what we've been discussing. They just make updates to the existing rules that were made by the statute that passed. This more involved rulemaking process, there will be a period for public comment and in board hearings then. We don't have those dates yet. We will make those available on Rick's website.
so when do you think the paperwork will be submitted for those?
I am working on it. We're in a bit of a crunch. There was
Yeah.
something passed called the Student Success Act.
Right.
Some of y'all may have heard about. And right now, the department's entire apparatus is focused on getting all of that taken care of. So I don't have any projections on when farm to school will get fitted in, but we will fit it in.
So maybe what we can do is Aaron and everybody, we can, as soon as the paperwork is submitted and Matt hears back from the BOE on when what the timeline is, Rick will post it to the website.
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe Rick, maybe we can send out a note letting everybody know that the timeline for public input for the permanent rules has posted.
And it won't be just like an afternoon. We're not going to be jerks about it. I mean, there's going to be several weeks for people to offer comment and to advise us on these things.
All right. Another question from Anna Garwood.
Do you want to read it?
Anna asks, can you please clarify if an educator planning their daily lessons is in the 20% or the 80%? It would be difficult for an educator in front of kids. Okay, it would be difficult for an educator in front of kids 80% of their time with only 20% for everything else. Mm-hmm. Or is 20% for the organizational costs such as program development, tracking, evaluation and administration, et cetera, and all of educators' time would be implementation? Question.
Okay, I will answer this. Without getting into too much of the nuts and bolts, I think a lot of this question will have to be covered during the training like I do every year, and we can get into specific examples and our frequently asked questions document. But essentially, the intent of the grant, as we've seen it from the legislator, is they want to pay, the money wants to go to the kids and not to overhead or planning as much. So I've seen claims that you can be creative and make sure you get figure out a lot of that stuff that's going to activities. Find creative ways to get your time into that, but it's hard to approve budgets and plans that just have more than 20% of just planning overhead types of things. So the answer to your question is 80% of the stuff should go to activities with kids. And so you might have to be creative in how you do that.
Okay, and then Sheila has a question about, is the upper limit of the grant amounts part of rulemaking? In other words, if we have comments about making the individual grants larger, is this the time to suggest an increase in grant size?
Well, we do have a rule about the education grant being capped at $100,000, right? That is a rule. So yes, if you would like to submit a comment about we want it more than $100,000 and here's why, this would be a good time for that.
And then Melina has a comment about the education grants, some of the allowable costs. I think 20% for coordination is low. In my experience, it takes a considerable amount of scheduling and coordination to provide quality hands-on food, garden, or farm education.
Thank you for that comment. I appreciate it. And I've heard it loud and clear over the years, but and again, I think that the stance like from other departments and Department of Education, they don't typically, like when they're other parts of the building, not child nutrition, that's not a part of stuff they fund, you know. And I use the analogy, and I've talked to this before, where I am married to a teacher, and she does not get 1 day of 1 hour of prep time. She doesn't. She does it on weekends and nights. And so the public sector, I mean, that's just the way it is. That was one of the stipulations with the legislature that said they wanted to get this out to the kids and not overhead. So that's how we're running this. Thank you.
All right, if you have comments about that 20% or suggestions for, other amounts, this is a good time to put those in the chat box. I did want to make I did overlook something earlier. I just wanted to quickly review, which is that the eligible entities for the competitive education grants also already include education service districts, federally recognized Indian tribes, and schools overseen by the Bureau of Indian Education, as well as nonprofit organizations, commodity commissions or councils, and then soil and water conservation districts. So I did neglect to mention those earlier, and I know there were a couple questions about some of those entities and if they were eligible. So, all right, we're going to leave the chat box open just for a few minutes, as you guys are still probably thinking around some of these sections, and in case you have more comments or feedback.
This is Megan. Can I ask a question verbally?
Oh, go ahead, Megan.
Thank you. Would you be able to provide either now or in an email follow-up? I think we could use a little more clarity about by when you need our comments for this process. So I'm really clear that there's another formal process for providing formal comments on the proposed rules, but right now you're offering us an opportunity to submit chat and to submit email, and just want to know that the network and partners may need some time to pull those together, and just want to know how long we have to get that to you to be considered as part of this process.
As we've mentioned before, Megan, we don't have those dates and time frames set as of today. Once we get them set, Rick will get them posted on his website. I'm sure he and Amy would be more than happy to send out emails to their stakeholder lists with that information. And then I know we can rely on the Farm to School Network to make sure it's broadcast even further afield. So that information will be coming out. It's just that we don't have it today at this time.
Okay, and you're talking, Matt, about this kind of informal input process that we're in right now.
No, your question was about opportunities to offer public comment and input on the rules, and that's what my answer was to address. If you're asking,
okay, so that wasn't my question.
Folks can
my question is actually not about that. It was about this. I'm wondering about this process. By when you need our feedback for this more informal process.
So are you asking Megan specifically for the deadline, the last day for our informal process?
Yeah, either now or if you could clarify that and send it out by email in the next few days. So we know how long we have to send you follow-up emails and give you input now.
Okay. Yeah, I don't have a deadline right now because we are waiting on finding out when the formal process starts. So like one ends and then the other begins, but I figure that out and we can send it out.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we have another question, or we have a comment in here from Sheila, a recommendation that the education grants cap at $200,000. She says that to serve a small district, it generally costs a minimum of $200,000. All right, thank you for that, Sheila. And then we also have a question from Anna Garwood. Is there still a 10-hour per student requirement? We have found that is difficult for some principals to schedule since they have half-hour time slots in their specialists. I think that means specialists schedule. That is a criteria for awardship in the RFA. It's not in the rules.
We haven't.
But I don't think that will be adjusted, is my understanding.
Well, let's put it this way. We haven't had plans to adjust that. We were pretty adamant about that. We put a lot of time into that 10-hour thing, our network over the years, and that was really important. We did go back and forth over that, and we brought it up over a couple of different sessions, and so we haven't had any plans to change it.
I think if there was other educators on the line, if there were other best practices, or if other educators could demonstrate, what from the field is, if it's not 10 hours per student, what is a best practice for the number of education hours per student that they'd want to give us as a recommendation, that might be a way to approach this as well.
But like Aaron was saying, like recommendations for the RFA, we don't need to do a rule about it. That's the RFA. So if you want to send us comments about that, please, you could do that. Just send me an email.
Okay, Sheila has a follow-up to her previous comment. I believe it's about setting the maximum for education grants at 200,000, saying that would allow successful programs to grow. Otherwise, growth might require applying for 2 grants.
And I will say, just as a little caveat to that cap, we did give more than 100,000 to some folks out there because we had some operations that weren't successful for whatever reason. They weren't spending their money. And so I was tapping people on the shoulder saying, hey, do you want more money? And we were reallocating funds. And so that was something we did. And I know a couple of you guys did receive more funding. So, there's always that opportunity too. But but now we have an opportunity to look at those cap levels now that we have more money. So, Maureen, a really good question is like, how do we determine how to, like, when we're reallocating money, what we do to give money? And that's a good question because it's our number one job to make sure all the money is spent. So we go back to the legislature and say, thank you, give us more money because we spent it all. And so it's a full-time job, well, a part-time job. It's a part-time person, but my assistant, Amy Jean, has a tracking spreadsheet, both for the procurement grant and the education grant. And all year long, she's looking for adequate progress. And so it's like on the procurement side, she sends emails to people saying, hey, you haven't spent anything, we're going to take it away. And finally we, after giving multiple warnings, we take money back, and then we award it to districts, and I get all of their claims in, so I see the kinds of things that we were talking about on this today about the procurement competitive grant, like some of the things. People are buying really awesome, good things. They're direct buying from farmers. They're not just mailing it in using their mainline distributor only. So we're calling these people and saying, hey, you guys have spent all your money. Do you want more? And so we do that, like on the procurement side, and we're very equitable about how we do that. Now the next one for the education, we had a couple groups, a few of them that weren't successful in spending all their money for the first time. Usually the education grant, I don't have to worry about it. I have very solid nonprofit folks that apply for this, but there was one nonprofit that went under for a while, and they just had internal problems. Another one just didn't submit any claims until the very last week after 2 years. So it was like we're constantly emailing and saying, hey, we need to do that. And so same thing, people had plans, and we were looking at those education grants. The criteria is like, have they spent all their money yet? Do they need more? Have they had really solid claims? Have they spent it on great things? And so I'm constantly calling these people saying, okay, there's an opportunity for getting more, but I'm not going to typically reallocate to those operations that aren't spending their money. Even they might have a plan to spend it only in the spring of the second year, and that makes me really nervous. So, but those folks that have spent all their money and spent it on awesome things, and depending on what they've submitted through their grant claims, we will reach out to them and get more. That's how we do it. It's just by practice, by constantly emailing and talking to our folks. So thanks for that question. Okay, Aaron has a really good question. It says, Rick, you just said for the second time that someone can send an email regarding suggestions for the RFA, correct? But Matt said earlier the agency does not request input internal process like RFAs, which is also correct. How can we both be correct? Like just what you said, Aaron, if you want to send me suggestions, I'll consider suggestions, but we don't have a formal process for people to work with us on the RFA. It's something that it says in the bill that Oregon Department of Ag and Oregon Department of Ed will design the program, which is what Amy and I are doing right now, and then we ODE runs the program. So, but I'll take suggestions on the RFA. We've worked with people in the past. And especially when we were new at this, when we were designing it, we had a lot more public sessions because we didn't know how to run it back in the day, back in 2012. So there was a lot more stakeholders in it, but we have it down now. The most important part is just the definition part, and then the rest we do in practice. So if you do have suggestions about some of the things that we've talked about, I will take suggestions, and then we will go from there. And do we have a deadline for if they have suggestions for the RFA? I don't right now, but let me see. Hang on. September 30th. That is for the RFA. How's that? Boom. If you want a date, that's a date for the RFA. And so I'll have to stick to that now. So. Okay.
All right, we will just continue to leave the chat box open, or if you have a question, you can also use your phone. All right. Well, I think we're going to go ahead and close the webinar unless anybody, we're not seeing any, we have no more chat box messages that have come in. So we'll just do a last, sort of a last call for any questions or chats for 30 seconds, and then we'll close the webinar. Okay, everybody, thank you so much for taking the time today to give us feedback and suggestions. Like we said earlier, if you have any questions or if you have further comments about the rule, the draft that we sent out today in the agenda with some of the suggested language, to please go ahead and send those directly to Rick. And then once we find out more about the timeline for the more formal process, Rick will make sure to send out an email about that of when that information's posted on the ODE website. If you have any other questions, please contact us directly. Thank you.